Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to continue talking about bad methodology in the interpretation of what is happening in ancient non-biblical literature. I want to explain the fact that this compositional device approach is really poor when applied even to secular works. And that's important because the claim is that somehow we're finding these compositional devices in these secular works, and that's part of how we know that these things were accepted at the time and that the gospel authors would have felt free to use them. There are questionable steps even after that, whether the gospel authors would have felt free to use them even if they had existed at the time, and so forth. But this argument fails at multiple points. One of the ways in which my work here has been said to be so extreme and my tone so bad is that I've said the compositional device argument fails at every point. Well, there you go. There's my extreme statement. It does. It fails at every point, and it fails when applied to the secular literature itself. It's just a very poor approach. Now, last time we talked about a refusal to harmonize in just a very natural way, that multiple senators were agreeing on a particular proposal. That's what you do in a political body. Or that multiple senators who were opposed to Julius Caesar were using a similar talking point about Julius Caesar. Well, that's very common in politics. And so a discrepancy was being created where there wasn't one, and then there was some kind of pointless alleged transferal that Plutarch was carrying out deliberately to make one guy say something when he didn't really say it, and for no particular reason. So there wasn't even a discrepancy there. This time, I'm going to be talking about a place where there is really a discrepancy. I don't think that it's possible to harmonize these two works, but the possibility of a simple error is being overlooked. You're just sort of skipping that and assuming that Plutarch deliberately changed a particular detail, a particular aspect of the story, instead of that in one of his versions he just made a mistake. And that's really odd. And it shows the neglect of the burden of proof that we have in this methodology. That you find what you think is a discrepancy, and then you just leap over all kinds of possibilities, very ordinary possibilities, for the thing that in a sense seems cooler, I gather. To the theorist, that we don't want to say that Plutarch made a mistake. That's kind of boring. So we're going to say that, no, he did it on purpose. And sometimes the methodology doesn't even bother to suggest a reason, as in the one last week, and to some extent the one I'm going to be discussing this week too. So let me explain the discrepancy, in this case, again, between two of Plutarch's lives. And not all of these are between Plutarch and, two of his lives. The one I talk about next week won't be between two of Plutarch's lives, but this one is. Okay, Plutarch has a life of Pompey. Pompey was a Roman statesman. And he also has something called the life of Cato the Younger, or Cato Minor. And these cover some of the same events. In the life of Pompey, Plutarch is talking about how Pompey was kind of a hypocrite. And as a statesman, he had passed a law against giving what was called an encomium at someone's criminal trial. So I guess this would be a little bit like what we would call a character witness, where someone's on trial for having supposedly done something wrong, and then you bring in somebody to just go on and on about what a great guy he is. Okay, and kind of, he's my buddy, I endorse him. And the encomium would be sponsored by or from someone who supposedly knew him, to try to move the judges. You can't convict him of this crime. He's just a great guy. And Pompey had said, no, we're not going to do that anymore. And I don't know what all of his reasons were, but you could see he might have considered it a waste of time or whatever. But then Plutarch points out that even though he had passed that law, when one of his friends was on trial, he actually did present an encomium in favor of that friend. Now, in the life of Pompey, he says, Plutarch says very explicitly that he came personally and delivered this encomium in favor of his friend in the court, in the trial. So it can't be a case where Plutarch is just speaking vaguely and saying, he made an encomium or gave an encomium where maybe someone else did it on his behalf. Plutarch's very explicit that he came and gave this encomium in person. Very clear. But in the life of Cato the Younger, he says that Pompey wrote the encomium and had it handed in, and then someone else gave it on his behalf in favor of his friend in his friend's trial. Now, when in his book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels, when Dr. Licona considers this discrepancy, he says that Plutarch transfers the encomium to the literal mouth of Pompey, since Dr. Licona says he knew that he was behind it, that Pompey was behind it. Now, we've already seen that since isn't required for Dr. Licona and Christopher Pelling, whom he's sometimes following, to make a claim of transferal, because in the case we discussed last time, within the Senate, one senator wasn't like using another senator as his agent. There was no such thing of one person being behind it or anything. It was just supposedly that just sort of randomly Plutarch said, I'm going to have this guy say it instead of this guy. So don't get confused in thinking that this kind of transferal, even when it's fact-changing, is somehow, nothing to worry about, because at least we're only going to restrict it to cases where this guy is really behind it and using somebody else as an emissary. It's definitely not restricted to those cases. And I could give other examples of that as well, but I already did give one last week. And it's not even really clear what Plutarch's motive is supposed to have been for changing this. Now, one of the things I'm often pointing out is that good faith error is being overlooked. That instead, it's always assumed, this is like a deliberate change. I know this isn't how it happened, but I'm going to make it happen this way when I write this story. And just ignoring good faith error. And yes, we are going to get back to the Gospels eventually. And if you're watching this, you may be an inerrantist, a traditional inerrantist, and say, well, I'm not going to apply that good faith error thing when we get back to the Gospels. Okay, I get that. But I want you to consider these examples from secular history where the issue of inerrancy just isn't really even in the ballpark, because I want you to see how bad the methodology is. And I want you to see how the reportage approach that I'm taking is far more akin to the approach that you as a traditional inerrantist are taking to the Gospels. Because usually, at least in my experience, traditional inerrantists are often using common sense harmonizations like we used last week when discussing the senators and their insults against Caesar. So I want you to see how this is just a bad methodology even when inerrancy isn't in the mix. So why the assumption that Plutarch deliberately made Pompey come in person when he knew that he didn't come in person? Now, one tempting answer to this would be, well, because in the life of Cato the Younger, he makes it clear that he knows that Pompey didn't come in person. Well, okay, but does that mean he knew it at the very time that he was writing the life of Pompey? For example, is there any argument given, and I'm going to say no, Dr. Licona doesn't even try any such argument, that the order of them was that first Plutarch wrote the life where he knew that Pompey didn't come in person, and then only later wrote the life where he says that Pompey did come in person. If you made an argument to that effect, you might say, well, he wouldn't have forgotten it that quickly if he had it so clearly in his mind that he didn't come in person. But we don't know what order they were written in. So the mere fact that at some point he knew that Pompey wrote it and gave it to somebody else to read it doesn't mean that he knew it at the time that he was writing the life of Pompey, right? Okay. Well, Dr. Lacona refers to an argument that Christopher Pelling has made that a certain group of 6 of Plutarch's lives were written at around the same time. And when you read and you look into it, first of all, it's quite a conjectural argument. It's by no means a knockdown that we could just take it as a given. But second, it's within a period of like a year to 2 years. So you could easily think that Pompey came in person mistakenly and then just pick up some information. You can gain new information quickly, right? It's not like he's literally writing all of this in some, godlike present, immediate same moment where he knows all of the things all at the same time. You can be confused about something on Monday and get unconfused about it on Tuesday. So the fact that these are both in this set of 6 that were supposedly written at about the same time, even waiving the conjectural nature of that, by no means overthrows the possibility of a good faith error. I can readily imagine a situation where Plutarch heard about Pompey giving this encomium, where some phrase like giving the encomium is used ambiguously. Maybe somebody summarized what happened for Plutarch and maybe didn't mean to, confuse anybody, but just say, he gave an encomium on his friend when his friend was on trial, even though he passed a law against that. Gee, what a hypocrite. Okay, and just said it that way. And so then Plutarch could have, in all good faith, assumed that he gave it in person. And then he could have gotten a hold of a more specific source. We don't know what that was for these events, and read up on it more and gotten back to, okay, he wrote it and he had somebody else give it. And then that's the way he explains it in the other life, after he's got this new information. Now, that's a conjecture. I'm not saying we know that, but it's an extremely plausible thing to happen. Misunderstanding happens in human interactions all the time. If you have a good friend, you may misunderstand that person even if you know one another well. All the more so if you read something briefly on the internet, or it's a headline or something, and you get an impression from it that isn't really the way that it is. That's just the fate of human communication, for misunderstandings to occur. And this is a place where we can imagine how such a misunderstanding could have occurred. So he could have sincerely thought that Pompey came in person and delivered this encomium on his friend, even though he was supposedly opposed to that, and then have learned that no, that wasn't really how it was, and written it more accurately in the other life. Okay, in the other, the one of Cato the Younger. So I'm putting this forward to point out the neglect of these kinds of common sense explanations, even when there is a real discrepancy. And this is why I developed something that I called a flowchart in The Mirror of the Mask, where we first ask, is there even really an apparent contradiction here? So, for example, why is my God, why have you forsaken me, even an apparent contradiction with I am thirsty? Like, why couldn't Jesus have said both? What's even supposed to be the problem? And then if there is an apparent contradiction, is there a reasonable harmonization? And then I ask, well, could this be a good faith error? Because the discrepancy hunting scholars are just jumping over all of this. Couldn't this have been a good faith error where the person just, he just got it wrong? And then I ask, well, was this just propaganda? Was he in fact trying to mislead people? So, for example, in this case, let's suppose that Plutarch really had said to himself, I know Pompey didn't come in person, but I want to make him look somehow even more hypocritical by coming to give that encomium in person. Like somehow that'll make him look worse. Well, how does it work to make him look worse if nobody believes you? If this is just understood kind of thing, and everybody's taking your Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans with a very large shaking of salt, okay? And like, I know that he could be changing stuff all over the place here because that's just the genre. It's part and parcel of the genre. So I don't know if Pompey really came in person. Well, if he was doing it to make him look worse, then that wouldn't work, right? Because everybody would know that that might not really have been how it happened. It would have very little effect. So that possibility of propaganda and trying to mislead people is something that has to be very seriously considered if we're using this kind of discrepancy hunting method. We're not even claiming to find this in some list somewhere, but that's just how they're interpreting what Plutarch did or what Tacitus did or what Sallust did, and then saying, see, now we found them, now we're going to go apply this to the Gospels over here because now we just independently know that this is something ancient authors do. You need to be a lot more careful about whether you've really interpreted the ancient authors correctly in the first place. Next time I'm going to be talking about a different place where I think it's plausible that there was a good faith error. I actually think in the one I'm going to do next time that it might be harmonizable also by an additive harmonization, and I'll give both of those possibilities, but easily could be a good faith error. So I hope you're enjoying this. This is kind of geeky and dusty here at the beginning of 2025, starting it during still the season of Christmas. Don't forget there are 12 days of Christmas. And like and subscribe and come back to the Lydia Magruder channel where we're making common sense rigorous.